On March 7, 2024 at Fort Campbell, a U.S. Army intelligence analyst was arrested. To the outside world, it looked like another espionage case. Another headline. Another name. But prosecutors say this was something colder than that. For nearly 2 years, the man in custody had been sending sensitive U.S. military information to someone he believed was connected to the Chinese government. By the time the case surfaced, it was no longer one leak. It was a channel. Quiet, repeated, built from inside the system itself. His name was Korbein Schultz. He was not an outsider trying to break into a secure network. He was already inside. A sergeant, an intelligence analyst assigned to the 506th Infantry Battalion. Court records say his work gave him access to national defense information, and DOJ later said the contact reached him shortly after he received TS/SCI clearance. That detail matters, because the most dangerous breaches are rarely dramatic at the start. They do not begin with a dead drop in the rain or a coded radio in the dark. Sometimes, they begin with a message that looks like work. According to the indictment, that message came through a freelance web platform. The sender claimed to be in Hong Kong and linked to a geopolitical consulting firm overseas. The first request did not sound like treason. It sounded like paid analysis lessons from Russia's war in Ukraine and what the United States should do to help defend Taiwan if it were attacked. Schultz delivered a draft on July 6, 2022. He was paid $200. 2 days later, prosecutors say Schultz told the contact he wanted to turn it into a long-term partnership. That is the moment this story changes. Not with a gunshot, not with a raid, with a decision. Small enough to rationalize, large enough to open the door. And once that door opened, the buyer stopped asking for opinions. He started asking for something far more valuable material that was never supposed to leave the system at all. Before he became a defendant in federal court, Korbein Schultz looked like exactly the kind of person the system was built to trust. He was a U.S. Army sergeant, an intelligence analyst. He held a top-secret/sensitive compartmented information clearance. According to the indictment, he had been trained on how to handle classified information, how to store it, how to distribute it, and how to protect controlled material from people who had no right to see it. He also signed acknowledgments that if anyone unauthorized ever tried to get sensitive information from him, he was supposed to report it within 24 hours. That warning was not buried in fine print. It was part of the job, part of the culture, part of the firewall. And yet the approach that reached him in 2022 did not look like an attack on national security. It looked like an opportunity. Small, plausible, easy to explain away, at first. The early exchanges were almost mundane. A man claiming to be based in Hong Kong, tied to a foreign geopolitical consulting firm, asked for written analysis on the war in Ukraine and what it might mean for Taiwan. Schultz delivered. He got paid. Then the tone changed. Court records say the buyer made something clear very quickly. Open source material was worth less. Anything not publicly available would bring in more money. Original, exclusive, internal documents, marked material, the kind of information that does not belong in a private inbox. Schultz did not pull back. Prosecutors say he leaned in. By late July, the conversations had already moved beyond research and into concealment. They discussed disguising payments as money for car customization. They shifted communications onto encrypted platforms. And Schultz, according to the indictment, began talking like a man who had already crossed the line in his head before he fully crossed it in practice. That is what makes the opening phase of this case so unsettling. There was no dramatic break, no single cinematic moment where loyalty shattered in public view. There was just a series of choices, each one easier than the last. Each one paid for, each one pulling him deeper into a relationship that now wanted more than analysis. It wanted access, and Schultz had plenty of it. Soon, the request would stop circling around the edge of secrecy and go straight through it. Then, the scale of it came into focus. This was no longer a side deal built on abstract military commentary. According to prosecutors, Schultz began exploiting his authorized access to restricted U.S. government systems and pulling out documents that went far beyond opinion or theory. He was not breaking in from the outside. He was using the keys he had already been given. That is what made the breach so dangerous. The system had been designed to keep enemies out. It was never meant to stop a cleared analyst from becoming the delivery mechanism himself. What he allegedly passed along was not random. It formed a picture, operational material tied to his unit's planned deployment to Eastern Europe in support of NATO. Assessments and lessons drawn from the war in Ukraine, and how those lessons could apply to a Chinese move against Taiwan. Technical information connected to platforms like the F-22A, the HH-60, and even systems tied to intercontinental ballistic missiles. Other files touched on Chinese military tactics, the PLA Rocket Force U.S. exercises in South Korea, and the Philippines military satellites. HIMARS THAAD, and how American forces were studying drone warfare on a large battlefield. Piece by piece, that collection became more than stolen paper. It became a map of capability, a map of readiness, a map of how the United States might fight, move, defend, and respond in the very theaters where a future war could erupt. And the messages, as described in court records, suggest the appetite on the other end was growing. The buyer wanted more, better material, higher classification, greater exclusivity, more risk, more value. Schultz prosecutors say understood the pattern. He even joked about the money. At one point, after being told more sensitive documents would pay better, he replied that he hoped so because he needed to get his other BMW back. That line is almost absurd, until you remember what was really being traded. Because by then, this case was no longer just about one man selling secrets. It was starting to look like the beginning of a collection network. By late 2023, the danger was no longer just in the files already gone. According to the case record, Schultz and the man prosecutors called Conspirator A were discussing something even more serious: expansion. Another Army intelligence analyst. Another person inside the machine. Another access point, this time tied to Indopacom, the command at the center of America's military posture in the Pacific. The messages described a slow approach. Careful, patient, nice and slow. That phrase matters because it suggests this was not just theft. It was recruitment, the kind that can turn one compromise into a chain. And by then, the world outside was already changing. U.S. authorities had arrested Navy sailors in separate cases involving sensitive information and alleged links to China. Court documents say Schultz and his contact talked about those arrests too, not with fear, with caution. They discussed being more careful, hiding better, tightening the method, not ending the operation. That is the moment the case stops feeling like greed and starts feeling like something more disciplined on the other end. Someone was learning, adjusting, staying in the hunt, but secrecy leaves patterns, repeated payments, encrypted communication over months, downloads from government systems, screenshots sent out from sensitive documents, including pages tied to the F-22A, requests for more exclusive material, conversations about bringing in another analyst. Investigators did not need one spectacular mistake. They had a timeline, a trail, a relationship that kept reproducing itself across platforms, money transfers, and classified access. Then, the door closed. On March 7, 2024, Schultz was arrested at Fort Campbell. No dramatic chase through a foreign capital. No last-minute escape. Just the sudden end of a secret partnership that had been running in parallel with his military career. The analyst who once imagined himself as something like Jason Bourne was now in federal custody, facing charges that could expose every choice he had tried to hide. But the real weight of the story was still ahead, because the question was no longer whether he had betrayed the system. It was how much damage he had done before anyone stopped him. The public ending came in two stages. First, on August 13, 2024, Korbein Schultz pleaded guilty to the core charges against him: conspiring to obtain and transmit national defense information unlawfully exporting controlled military data to China, and accepting bribes in exchange for sensitive, non-public U.S. government information. Then, on April 23, 2025, the Justice Department announced his sentence, 84 months in federal prison. 7 years. That is the official ending on paper. But it is not the full meaning of the story, because the damage was never measured only in courtroom language. By the time the case closed, DOJ said Schultz had transmitted at least 92 sensitive U.S. military documents for roughly $42,000. Not millions, not some grand ideological prize. Roughly the price of a car paid out in exchange for pieces of American military readiness deployment planning, tied to NATO support in Eastern Europe. Lessons from Ukraine that could apply to Taiwan, technical manuals for aircraft, and missile systems material on Chinese military tactics. And the PLA rocket force. Details of exercises in South Korea and the Philippines and documents tied to satellites, missile defense, HIMARS THAAD and counter-drone warfare. That is what makes the case so unnerving. He did not sell one secret. He helped assemble a mosaic. And in intelligence work, a mosaic can be more dangerous than any single page. There is another reason this case lingers. It was never just about what Schultz already handed over. The indictment described efforts to pull another Army analyst into the scheme, someone connected to Indopacom, with conversations about doing it in a nice and slow fashion. That detail changes the scale of the story. It suggests a process, a patient attempt to grow access from one insider into something wider, something harder to stop. And that may be the real historical lesson here. Espionage does not always arrive wearing the face people expect. Sometimes it arrives as freelance work, a private message, a small payment, a harmless request, then another, until one man inside a secure system is no longer analyzing war from a distance. He is feeding it.